In March of 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. led many protesters in several attempts to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery. These protesters marched with a purpose. They were working to gain voting rights for all African Americans in Alabama. The walk was approximately 54 miles, and even through all the trials and tribulations, no one gave up, no matter what age, gender, or race. In a reaction to the incidents of unjust police brutality, 36th President Lyndon B. Johnson gave the famous speech, "We Shall Overcome." The title had been from a line in his speech that he had retrieved from a civil rights anthem, and it would later become a sort of slogan for the civil rights as well. On March 7, 1965, during the first of those attempts, before even leaving Selma, the nonviolent protesters were ruthlessly beaten by state police. The protesters were forced to return. This day would become known as Bloody Sunday. In another attempt on March 9, 1965, the protesters were again met by state police as they were crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Except, as King had previously agreed with President Lyndon B. Johnson, the protesters knelt, prayed, and fled the conflict. This event would later be called Turnaround Tuesday. Later that same day, 3 white ministers, including James Reeb, who had participated in the march, were attacked by a mob that was against the civil rights movement. On March 11th, Reverend James Reeb died of injuries relating to the attack. Martin Luther King delivered the eulogy at his funeral in Selma 4 days later. March 13th, LBJ calls out Alabama Governor George Wallace for acts of police brutality against nonviolent protesters. Wallace retorted that the blame was to fall upon Martin Luther King for stirring up trouble. LBJ rejected his false accusation. Nuns from the New York Archdiocese joined together on March 14th to protest the wrongdoings that had been occurring in Selma in the weeks prior. About 100,000 citizens joined in their fight. On March 15th, after the large protests in New York, LBJ addressed Congress to propose a voting rights bill. This address is more commonly known as his famous speech, "We Shall Overcome." In an excerpt from his speech, LBJ said, "At times, history and fate meet at a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. There, long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. Many of them were brutally assaulted. One good man, the man of God, was killed. There is no cause for pride in what has happened in Selma. There is no cause for self-satisfaction in the long denial of equal rights of millions of Americans. But there is cause for hope and for faith in our democracy in what is happening here tonight. For the cries of pain and the hymns and protests of oppressed people have summoned into convocation all the majesty of this great government, the government of the greatest nation on earth. Our mission is at once the oldest and the most basic of this country, to right wrong, to do justice, to serve man." Even after the president's empowering speech on March 16th, the protesters were again met by police, but this time the police had an even better advantage. They were on horses and they were armed with clubs and whips, and they proceeded to use them to again attack the peaceful protest. The attack left the protesters physically and emotionally scarred, but they were determined to win the rights that we are all entitled to as Americans. A federal judge finally ruled on March 17th that the protesters are allowed to complete their full march. To ensure the success of the march, LBJ sent some 2,000 Alabama National Guard troops to oversee the march and make sure that it won't be stopped. On March 21st, the proud marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge where Bloody Sunday had occurred a mere 3 weeks earlier. The thousands of triumphant and exhausted marchers reached Montgomery, Alabama on March 25th. Martin Luther King Jr. described it as a shining moment in the conscience of man. The trek was the end result of a 3-month-long campaign against the discrimination of all African American citizens of Alabama. This march provided the government with enough support to push forward with the Voting Rights Bill of 1965.